Dear colleagues, we are delighted to welcome you to this IPA webinar organized by the website editorial board. Thank you for being so many to participate. Today, we will continue the presentation of IPA committee's work with the Gender and Sexual Diversity Studies Committee. As we all know, psychoanalysis has become a discipline by taking up the challenge of elucidating and treating the missing link in the scientific development, the understanding of the human psychic suffering and the unconscious functioning. Thus, in psychoanalysis, psychic function is based on the intersection of pathological and normal, individual and collective, biological and mental. We all have in mind that the unconscious is regulated by drives and psychosexuality that transmutate and change with others in unconscious and asymmetrical ways. These changes take place there where other and outside are fatally engaged with I and inside. Identity will be about entering into a psychic sexual dimension of experience, engaging bisexual identifications and objects. The cultural studies field of gender and sexual diversity studies appeared the last decades on the social ground of the war of sexes. It is engaged against a hegemonic normativity and is influenced by interdisciplinary theories on femininity, subjectivity, and social ethics. Cultural philosophers try to respond to the enigma of the construction of the subject sexual identity. They try to deepen the famous apophthegma of Napoleon, anatomy is destiny. They try to deepen the essence of bisexuality, femininity, and masculinity. For us psychoanalysts, a question raised today: which is the destiny of the subject and of the modern civilization? Our panelists will present today the work of the IPA Committee on Gender and Sexual Diversity Studies. Before introducing them, let me remind you the usual schedule of our IPA webinars. In the first part, our panelists will present their topic during 10 to 15 minutes each, and then in the second part, during the question and answer session, they will discuss with you and answer to your question you can type and send to us. For doing so, please post your questions in the question pane on the right-hand side of your screen. You have to go to the questions line, click on the white flash to open it, type your question, and send it. Questions will be answered in the question and answer session after the presentations. And please remember that all of us, panelists and attendees, we are responsible for our ideas and opinions. We will start with Marco Posadas. Please let me introduce him. Marco Posadas is a clinical social worker and licensed psychologist, chief clinical officer at the House of Purpose, a consulting firm where he develops psychoanalytically informed programs for organizations. He is a member of the International Psychoanalytical Association and the current chair of the Gender and Sexual Diversity Studies Committee of the IPA. He is faculty at the Toronto Institute of Psychoanalysis. He is adjunct faculty at Smith College School of Social Work in Northampton, and he served on the board of directors of the Ontario Association of Social Workers, where he was recipient of the 2013 International Leader Award for his work with under-reserved and marginalized populations. Marco, please.
Thank you, Ileana, and thank you, Dana and Leticia, for being in this webinar with me too. And thank you to the IPA for creating these opportunities. And also thank you to the audience who are here on a Sunday giving us their time. And so I will try to be brief and engaging. I'm going to talk about a little bit about the work that we're doing at the International Psychoanalytical Association in the committee that I have the honor to chair, some updates about the activities that we're doing, and few ideas to start the discussion around the type of resistance that we have encountered bringing topics of gender and sexual diversity, gender non-binary or gender polymorphism, as I call it. And so we're currently developing local networks. So if you're a psychoanalyst affiliated to the IPA and candidates, you can reach out to the committee to participate in the activities that we're creating. You can reach out and ask more. We're having a lot of presentations at the London International Conference of the IPA in July 24 to 27. And we're creating a study day in collaboration with the Committee on Women and Psychoanalysis in Europe. The dates for our study day are September 27 and September 28 of 2019. And the place will be Brussels, the house of the European Psychoanalytic Federation. And so there are going to be more activities for us to participate in this type of discussions. And so let me tell you a little bit of our experience. Before the creation of the Sexual and Gender Diversity Studies Committee, during the planning stages, there was a lot of ambiguity around addressing the issues of gender and sexual diversities within psychoanalysis. An important part of the committee's mandate of the International Psychoanalytical Association was to create spaces for IPA psychoanalysts, candidates, and non-IPA affiliated psychodynamic clinicians, psychotherapists, and students from mental health professions. There was an increasing number of people interested in psychoanalysis and wanted to discuss issues pertaining to clinical theory and clinical practice when talking about gender and sexual diversity. Our committee had anticipated some resistance historically present when addressing these type of topics in psychoanalytic institutions, but we were not able to identify what type of resistance we were going to encounter. And so, or what were the points that were going to be more contingent or more difficult to discuss within theory and practice. And so this webinar is one of the many steps that we're trying to engage with addressing this type of resistance, to open up spaces to start discussing how do we move from thinking a binary system into a system of gender that includes non-binary experience of sexuality and gender. So that got me thinking about the myth of Tiresias. I had the fortune of participating in a panel with Sheila Kavanagh and Paul Lynch here in Toronto, where Sheila brought the myth of Tiresias and follow the line of psychoanalysts that recommended reaching out to other type of myths or stories that were more inclusive of experience that fell outside of the gender binary. And so Tiresias, there's several different versions and contradicting versions of the myth of Tiresias. He's the official diviner of the House of Thebes, and one of the few and probably the most important trans character in Greco-Roman mythology. He goes from being a man to living as a woman for 7 years, then transformed back into a man again. Tiresias' story expands over 7 generations and has been written about previously in psychoanalysis and gender studies. The story of Tiresias is important for me because he starts with him as a male walking with the aid of a staff, and then encounters something that he sees as undecipherable or undistinguishable that happens to be 2 snakes tightly coiled together, copulating. And the vision of these sights offend him, and he hits the female snake with his staff. These deed triggers here Hera's rage and transforms him into a woman as a punishment for wounding the female snake. Tiresias then goes to marry, have children, do sex work, and go into religion and old age as all the things that are appropriate for female roles in antiquity. In 7 years living as a woman, Tiresias finds the two snakes again, but now follows the advice of Apollo, who advised him to only hit the male snake this time. And so after hitting the male snake, Hera transforms him into a male as a reward for learning his lesson. Tiresias now, as a male, gets later in trouble when he participates in a party for gods in the Olympus, and he asks Zeus questions. He's summoned to ask a question about who experiences the most sexual pleasure, whether it's men or women. And Zeus thinks that Tiresias, because he was the other sex, is able to answer these questions. And he responds to this, and his answer enrages Hera again. And Hera this time takes Tiresias' sides and makes him blind for developing the secrets of women to Zeus. And Zeus feels guilty and unable to do Hera's spell, gives him the gift of prophecy, long life, and the capacity to be able to keep his wits after that. And so, to me, this myth opens up a lot of thinking around how do we understand the strong reactions that we find in psychoanalysts and people when we start to talk about experiences that fall outside of gender. There seems to be something that gender provides as scaffolding that allow us to think of people before they become people and think of them as people. And so in this case, in Tiresias' myth, there's something that disorganizes him, confuses him, and makes him anxious, and he blames that on the outside, hitting the feminine. And so understanding this as an uprisal of aggression, an uprising of aggression that gets expressed in culturally sanctioned ways of communicating that aggression. In this myth, we see the most vulnerable part being the female snake. We can start to think the role of male privilege, violence expressed through masculinity, what is then thought as toxic masculinity. And I can go on and on and on about these ways of thinking gender and sexuality. And so to not take up too much time, when presented with the idea of gender may not be a binary system that supports power and control that can be linked to colonialist practices, we force the analyst to connect with what exists before what we know the sex of the baby. There's extensive writing within psychoanalytic theory that connects trans narratives to the Freud's definition of the uncanny and Kristeva's definition of the abject. And this reduces trans identities and trans bodies to grotesque and repulsive beings. It is as if in the ambiguous aspects of humanity or ambiguous aspects of human existence gets expressed through gender polymorphism, escapes the symbolization of a systemic order, and provides an opening for us to start thinking about these things. Why do we push back when we think of something that cannot be grasped within gender binary? The analyst faces this unnamed, unthought, and perhaps othered part of human experience and can resonate with the anxiety that may be sometimes hard to contain in sessions and identifies with the aggressor. And so in this place, we can carry a systemic or a transphobic system, but with C as in cisgender, so system, that unconsciously carry transphobic and heteronormative expectations and erases the possibility of gender creativity in patients, moving us from the analytic position of listening to the unconscious to acting at a super ego level, defining what's legitimate and opening us up for the possibility of projecting identification. And so I would love to stop here because I think both Leticia and Dana have a lot to continue this conversation, and I want to leave enough time for questions. And so thank you so much, and I will be here.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you so much for being so clear and for the time you you got. Now I will present you Leticia Glosser. Leticia is a training and supervising analyst for the Argentine Psychoanalytic Association. She is co-chair for Latin America of the International Psychoanalytic Association's IPA Committee on Sexual and Gender Diversity Studies. She is professor at the University of Buenos Aires. She is past president of the Argentine Psychoanalytic Association. She is the author of many books. She was awarded with the Celes Carcamo Prize in 1994 for her work, The Feminine Position, a Heterogeneous Construction. And her latest book in 2017 is entitled Sexual Difference in Debate, Bodies, Desires, and Fictions. Leticia, please.
Thank you, Eliana. My presentation is based on my books, Deconstructing the Feminine, and especially in Sexual Difference in Debate. And I want to say that as a co-chair for Latin America of this committee, I would like to begin by saying that our aim is to analyze and investigate the many sexual and gender subjectivities that depart from standing norms of social contract. In recent decades, sexual and gender diversity has become increasingly visible. Although they have always existed, as we know, they are acquiring growing acknowledgement and legality. On the one hand, these presentations represent movements of resistance that challenge constituted normative legalities. On the other hand, they coexist with cultural and social tendencies rejecting these presentations. We considered it important to encourage the creation of opportunities for debate on these issues, which generate conflicting positions among psychoanalysts. We recognize the difficulties involved in establishing an open debate in which each one can listen to the other's words, as in Bakhtin's concept of dialogism. This subject includes two aspects. One is recognition and non-discrimination of these presentations. This point concerns the inclusion of other groups affected by discrimination, women, as well as ethnic, religious, and racial groups, among others. However, I stress that non-discrimination is not enough, but certainly indispensable. It is the first step. The challenge is much greater. The second point, which interests me especially as a psychoanalyst, is the need to rethink certain established psychoanalytic concepts which may be an obstacle to clinical work. Each psychoanalyst's available ideologies, personal beliefs, and theories regarding sexual and gender diversities converge on this point. If they are not revised, positions exerting strong influence on the analytic process may become eternal and immovable. We recall many cases of homosexuality thwarted because they failed to fit into the norm. I wish to emphasize that rethinking certain theoretical categories does not tear down the psychoanalytic edifice which is already well established. The unconscious, infantile sexuality, drives, and transference are key elements, although different theoretical currents give these categories different interpretations. Other points may be revised or expanded without prejudice or damage to our discipline. If not, our clinical practice may fail, since these subjectivities will inevitably be considered abject, beyond the norm. In my opinion, several aspects of theory deeply involving psychoanalysis should be rethought. Please put the first slide again. The first slide, because the other one. Rethinking Theory 1. First, the concept of subject with which we work. This is the first point that it is important to emphasize. We consider the concept of subject a fabric of psychic multiplicities, unlike conceptions that propose a unitary, totalizing, and harmonious notion of subject. In this sense, we adopt Castoriadis' proposal of psychic magma, thinking on heterogeneous universes that inhabit subjectivity. Second, we question whether the Oedipus castration complex and its ideal resolution is enough to analyze these presentations. Of course, we work with the Oedipus complex as a clinical fact, but not as a universal category, since it contemplates only a normative, dualistic outcome for the construction of subjectivity. This limitation may become an obstacle since it is insufficient for analysis of the multiplicity of itineraries of desire and gender variants that we encounter in our times. There are other myths proposed, as Marcos said, and this is also open to debate. Third, in this light, we also question the standing ideals regarding the masculine-feminine polarity. We understand that these ideals respond to social discourse and practices deeply rooted in culture, language, and each person's subjectivity, and that they embody androcentric conceptions of social and family relations. However, in clinical work, thinking simply in terms of a masculine-feminine polarity falls short regarding these presentations and lead to impasses impossible to overcome. Fourth, these questions include our way of thinking about the category of sexual difference, since its access and recognition is usually considered indispensable for the symbolic construction of subjectivity. This is a crucial point for revision. Next slide. Next. Point fifth. Do we utilize contributions from gender theories? We know that its use and meaning in Anglo-North American psychoanalysis differs from those of French psychoanalysis. We consider that perspectives on gender should be utilized in psychoanalysis and make interfaces and links with the field of sexuality and desire. Point 6. In this context, how do we conceptualize the notion of family? Mainly the maternal and paternal functions concerning the construction of subjectivity, usually assigned to mothers and fathers in line with their gender and biological sex. 7. This issue relates to another important subject. What happens to children raised by non-conventional couples outside accepted normative canons? In other words, if homosexuality is considered a perversion, would the children of homosexual couples be considered perverse? Our approach is to think in terms of functions, as I said, caregiving, symbolic functions, which may not coincide with the mother and father, and may be independent of gender or sexual characteristics of their bodies. It is a question of contemplating the symbolic construction of subjectivity as broadly as possible, without it depending strictly on each person's sexual choice or gender. Thinking only on acceptance of a masculine or feminine identity or a heterosexual position is insufficient. A. We also include the role of psychoanalysts' personal and implicit theories, as well as their explicit theories. All the points that I mentioned are interlinked. We cannot think about one of them ignoring the others. I developed these questions in my books, but these questions undoubtedly involve the feminine position very strongly. I consider that horror of femininity, as Freud called it, is also related to rejections of other forms of sexuality that decenter the masculine phallic traditional model. This is not only a problem concerning drives or simply the masculine castration complex, but is intertwined with deeply rooted social discourse. Next slide. My proposals. As a psychoanalyst, my points of departure are the following. A, desire always exceeds accepted norms. B, assigned gender is a complex category that may be part of identity, but may be also experienced as something foreign to the ego or may contradict biological sex. C, bodies alone define neither sexual identity nor object choice. D, the object of desire is contingent, as Freud stated, which does not mean that it is arbitrary. E, ideals of masculinity and femininity vary historically. In this frame, I place my thinking on sexual and gender migrations and propose the need to recognize blind spots in this field as well as in the field of the feminine. Dualistic thinking is insufficient to think about the complexity of the psyche. Although masculine-feminine polarity is a cultural proposal running through us all, we should go beyond binary logic. Binary thought cannot be eliminated, as we know, because it is a part of language also, but it should be included within more broadly encompassing complexities, such as thinking in a triadic form, as the paradigm of hypercomplexity proposes. Next slide. For this reason, I propose to think about the production of sexual subjectivity, including at least three variables: body, gender, and sexuality desire, gender based on identifications, pierced through by current discourse and, as I said, by movement of resistance. They are heterogeneous variables whose interrelations are never harmonious, defining a singular subjectivity for each individual. Working with this point proposed requires the conception of an open psychoanalysis. Open in the sense of the open systems proposed by Morin, Prigogine, and others. An open psychoanalysis is a porous psychoanalysis in contact with other disciplines, as well as with social discourse and cultural practices. This approach implies work at intersections of concepts, of notions and theories, as well as experiences. Theoretical centers are extremely difficult to move, except at their borders. In philosophy, Ria said, being is constituted at the limes. The limes is the limit. The frontier is the place where the new or the event may be worked on. In various terms, whatever does not fit into our previous schemas. Next and last slide. My proposal is that access to a symbolic word depends on the way each subject assumes a network of differences. Anatomical difference, always signified by culture, gender difference, also signified by culture, psychosexual difference, linguistic and discourse differences. This multiplicity of differences, pierced through by inter and transsubjective determinations, determines how subjectivity is constructed beyond sexual orientation, although including it. To end, I would also like to highlight that the riddle of sexual difference is difference itself, and an empty slot, an empty place, concerning which narratives are often constructed and projected onto the feminine. Finally, difference as a category refers to recognition of otherness, and this is a fundamental element. In my opinion, this point changes the way to think about sexual and gender diversities. Well, I leave here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Leticia. Thank you for this so remarkably rich presentation. Thank you very much. And now it's Dana Amir. Dr. Dana Amir is a clinical psychologist supervising and training analyst at the Israel Psychoanalytic Society, a faculty member at Haifa University, poetess, and literature researcher. She is the author of 6 poetry books and 3 psychoanalytic non-fiction books. Her latest book, entitled Bearing Witness to the Witness, and it is in print. She is the winner of many national and international prizes, including the Francis Tustin International Memorial Prize, the IPA Sacerdoti Prize, the IPA Heyman Prize, and the IFPE Distinguished Psychoanalytic Educators Award. Thank you. Please, Dana, it's to you.
Thank you. My text is available here, so you can download it and follow if it's more convenient. Gender dichotomy is probably the most primary dichotomy internalized in human thinking. It acts as a prototype for all the latter dichotomies, in a sense inaugurating dichotomous thinking in general, first within the imaginary of the parent who holds the soon-to-be-born infant in his or her mind, and afterwards within the mind of the infant itself. As with any dichotomy, gender dichotomy may collapse into a saturated state, becoming fixated in a way that enables it only a minuscule degree, if any at all, of transformability, or alternatively, it may remain unsaturated, and in this sense contain movement, richness, and layered meanings. When does gender dichotomy become a rich dialectic, as opposed to being constituted as a saturated excess? An excess of saturated gender dichotomy forms in conditions that a priori encourage saturated divisions. The propensity for saturated divisions may be innate or acquired, always related to an anxiety of ambiguity and the need to defend oneself through rigid thinking against the unexpected and the impermanent. In most cases, this propensity for saturated divisions is a general inclination of thinking and language, which is not solely related to gender dichotomy, but it becomes especially charged in children who do not find themselves at the expected end of the gender dichotomy. In such cases, the combination of the primary gender ambiguity and the innate or acquired propensity for saturated dichotomies might evolve into a need to situate oneself on one gender pole, losing the freedom to experience, even in fantasy, dialectical movement between the two poles. Where gender categories do not serve thinking, but rather block it, children whose primary gender experience is ambiguous might feel trapped in a saturated dichotomy in which they cannot find themselves. In his article, The Other Room and Poetic Space, Ronald Britton develops the notion of the other room as the space of imagination and fiction. He suggests that the other room emerges as the subject imagines the parents' intercourse rather than observes their actual sexual relations. It concerns the unwitnessed primal scene rather than the actual one, the one we have imagined as happening in our absence and which exists only in our imagination, thereby becoming the space for fiction. Unlike Winnicott, who defined the transitional phenomenon as the psychological space arising from the relations between infant and mother, and hence situated between me and not me, Britton argues that the creative space emanates from the internal triangular space. Similar to Melanie Klein and Otto Rank, who argued that the origins of the theatrical stage are in the imaginary location of the parental sexual act, Britton claims that there is a primal romantic couple, a fantasized ideal supersexual parental couple consisting of mythical figures, a kind of primal Adam and Eve. Expelled from heaven, we are compelled as non-participating observers to imagine their paradise. That paradise becomes our other room, forever unfulfilled, accompanied with the pain of longing. Borrowing the terms this room and the other room from the field of poetic creativity and applying them to the field of gender, I would like to suggest that when gender becomes a saturated object, what is damaged is exactly this ability to create movement between this room of actual gender and the other room of the phantasmatic gender. The possibility of establishing a rich and layered gender space crucially depends on the creative movement between this room and the other room without each negating the other. When such a situation is possible, even a child whose initial gender experience is an ambiguous and layered one will feel that she can creatively move between the gender poles without this mobility in its concrete and non-concrete aspects, posing a threat. One can say that such movement between the different gendered spaces is an integrated movement that includes all rooms as well as the areas of overlap and interface between them within one house, namely within one identity, as opposed to the stagnation and stasis that characterize the polar, saturated gender state. Within what I refer to as a gender space, there is living movement between the polarities. In my book on the lyricism of the mind, I suggested a lyrical dimension of mental space, which is in charge of the integration of two experiential perceptual modes. The continuous mode, which perceives the world as predictable, explainable, and logical, and the emergent mode, which perceives the world as unpredictable, unexplainable, and constantly changing. The integration of these two modes of experience, which Bion originally identified as constituting the container-contained interaction, yields the capacity to presuppose constancy and continuity on the one hand, and to tolerate severe deviations from that constancy and continuity without losing one's sense of identity and biography on the other hand. Formulating his notion of container-contained interaction, Bion pointed at three possible types of this interaction, of which the one with the most powerful capacity for change is the symbiotic interaction, while the one with the most destructive power is the parasitic. If we formulate the interaction between the emergent and the continuous principles of the self in Bion's terms, we may suppose that wherever the interaction between the emergent and the continuous is parasitic in nature or takes the form of malignant containment, one of two things might happen. The continuous self may smother the emergent self, leaving the latter no space for movement or development, or alternatively, the emergent self might stretch the continuous self beyond its breaking point, crushing through its boundaries. Bion argued that the sense of catastrophe that attends such an interaction between the emergent and the continuous is related to the fact that the psychic space is unable to supply an experience of constancy beyond change, a constancy which is actually the primary condition for change. When the continuous principle prevails, the psychic space becomes lacking in depth and resonance, while when the emergent principle takes over, the psychic space turns into a terrifying nightmare. If, by contrast, the interaction is compatible, integration may occur, inaugurating the lyrical dimension of the psychic space. Gender excess can also be formulated in terms of the relationship between the continuous and the emergent. For example, an excess of a continuous gender experience as opposed to an emergent gender experience could damage the possibility of establishing a gender space which holds the continuous and the emergent in a fertile dialectic relation. On the other hand, an excess of emergent gender experience in which every shift threatens to change the deep nucleus of identity may undermine the possibility of a cooperative relationship between the two poles of gender dialectic, the actual and the phantasmatic. Gender is constantly in the process of emerging, yet every emergence needs a continuous container for its forcefulness and volatility. When there is a continuous gender that can contain the various gender emergences in a way that doesn't force the self to undergo a catastrophic identity change, a gender space is created. However, where the continuous is too fragile and rigid, and its encounter with the volatile and powerful emergent threatens breakdown, parasitical relations may form between the actual and the phantasmatic gender, resulting in anxiety that further builds up fragility and rigidness. It is precisely in such cases that it is important to think of psychotherapy or psychoanalysis as a process that encourages the possibility to contain the myriad shades of gender in a lively way, one that focuses on the integration between the actual and the phantasmatic, the continuous and the emergent, recognizing the crucial importance of a creative movement between them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dana. It was very poetic. Thank you. Now we are going to continue with the question-answer session. I would like to read you the first question. Do we have to make changes in our Freudian theories about Oedipus and the castration complex? Have you thought about some modification? Which would be that? Who wants to start? I think it's addressed to Leticia.
I think so.
Okay. I think that Oedipus complex, well, this is a sensitive topic, but I think that it must be reviewed, revised, because I think that the classical Oedipal conflict, I considered it a clinical fact, but it is based on a metaphor or narrative about mothers, fathers, and children on the basis of the nuclear family. And I think that nowadays there are other kinds of families, of organization, of what we could say the common life, or the life together. So I think that we should expand the Oedipus complex and perhaps also take into account other myths, as Marcos said, to singular consultations. Each patient is singular. So perhaps for some of them, neurotic patients, Oedipus complex is okay to understand what happens there. But I think it's limited to other kinds of consultations and perhaps other kinds of myths on one side, or expand the significance of the Oedipus complex is another way. For example, the complete Oedipus complex, I think that it's better to analyze any kind of consultations. That is the first step. But I think that we should think of the Oedipus not in terms of intra-family person personified way. I don't know if this is, you understand, the personified, not a personal father, mother, and child, but think about it as I said, as functions that can be done by another members of the family or outside the family, or by this social discourse itself. So this is different. This is different to think about agents of subjectivations that only think about subjectivity constructed inside the nuclear family. This is my opinion, and I think that in this sense, symbolic functions, for example, can be exercised not only by the father, we know that, but also the mother, and not because she has incorporated the father function, but because the mother by herself has the possibility of exercise symbolic functions. And so I name this function third-party function, so we can get it out from the paternal function, which seems something that has to do more with an androcentric conception of the way of constructing subjectivity. And now this.
Dana or Marco want to answer too? Dana?
No, Marco.
Marco, okay. Marco.
Marco, you're muted.
No. Wait, Marco, please.
It's not. There you go.
Okay.
For some reason, it was not working when I was trying to unmute it. I find this question very interesting because I find the Oedipal theory very useful, and I think the question goes to how are we finding it useful versus using Oedipal theory to define levels of pathology or diagnosing someone. I think there, just like in many other contingent aspects or culturally sanctioned aspects of Freudian theory that had been revised, for instance, Freud's thoughts about women. Those thoughts have been revised and expanded to include women's subjectivity around their own subjectivity. And so Freudian theory around the Oedipal myth, the use of the Oedipal myth, I found it very useful still when we use it, as Leticia mentioned, to describe family constellations or family organizations and how we respond to it, to hold it and articulate what's happening. And the third, the third function of symbolization through these relationships. And so, yes, I do believe not only that it needs to be reformulated, but that it has been reformulated and continues to be reformulated. I think it opens up the door for us to think of psychoanalytic practice as a living subject that changes from analysis to analysis, from different stages of our life to different times. And I think the political also creates a very different aspect of how we listen to these things. So, yes, thank you.
Dana, you want to add something?
Just last,
No?
just one line. I don't think that the question is if, for example, the Oedipal complex is relevant, but how can we make it relevant to other forms of sexuality, to other family forms, to other identity forms? The question is not if, it's how are we going to make it relevant, to rethink it in a way that let it stay relevant to our thinking.
Thank you. I will go on with the next question. It's a bit long. The notion of gender, introduced in the late 19th and early 20th century, came from sociologists and anthropologists who showed that sexual identity also depended on social factors and not only on anatomy, as previously stated. Since then, psychoanalysis has insisted on early identifications that allow the development of psychological bisexuality. The text on biology insists on genetic determination, so we have at least 3 orders of overdetermination. The question is about the choice of object, and my question starts from this astonishment. What forces us to choose an object?
Do
Who wants
anyone
to
want
start?
to go?
I think
I
Marco.
can start. I love these questions of one size fits all theories. I would have to say that I'm sorry, I don't have one size fits all answers, particularly to object choice. What I find in my work is that each story, particularly when you're um, articulating your own narrative around your choice of object, because to the question, what pressure us to choose an object and how many objects we get to choose. And so when we go outside of the hegemonic expectation of how we choose an object, then it opens the door to conceive the multiplicity of factors that go into our desire and how we express that desire. And what I find very pertinent to this question, who we choose as aim for that desire, how we go for object choice. And so there's the conscious aspects that push someone to choose an object, and then there's the unconscious aspects of it. And I would say that is a mix of lived experience and biological information and social training that lead us to find object choice as one of the ways that we can connect to ourselves. And so I don't have a formula of what pushes it. I find that it is definitely within the experience of the subject that leads them to lean towards a specific object choice, whether that includes different types of identities or different type of objects or different amount of objects that vary between case to case.
Yes, Leticia?
Yes, I think that is a very complex question because if we think on the complemental series, so we can say that we cannot say that there is one determination. There are unconscious aspects, and I think that they are the most important. And I think, as I said, that an object choice, the object is always contingent, as Freud said, but not arbitrary. So the historical aspects of the life of each person has to do about this. Genetic determinations, we don't know about that. That is an unknown aspect of our discipline up to date. So I cannot say anything about that, but Freud said that perhaps there were unknown aspects in the complementary series that we don't accede up to now. I think one thing that I want to say is that as Todorov said in Life in Common, in general, people have the tendency to live in common, to make groups in general. And this has to do with the necessity of recognition And this is something important, although it's not exactly a psychoanalytic concept, but this is important to understand different types of object choice that perhaps we should also take into account. So there is a multiplicity of determinations, and we cannot say nothing about one of them, ignoring the others. That's all.
Dana?
I was thinking of something as a poet, not as a psychoanalyst. I was thinking about poets always saying that they don't choose the words choose them. And I was thinking that in a way, it's the same with our objects. We choose them, but we are also chosen by them in a very rich way, in a very rich and complex way. And in a way, that's our story. That's the story of our life. What objects choose us? What objects do we choose?
Okay, I would like to read you two questions because the first one is related to previous aspects you have already answered, and the second one because it's related to what Dana just said. So the first one is continuing the first question. Do we also need to change the notion of psychic bisexuality to psychic polysexuality? And this is a question I said, and now I've sent to everybody. Now I will try to send, because there are new technical possibilities we have. So the second one, that everybody should have it in his screen, is to Dr. Amir, Dr. Dana Amir, which definition do you use for gender in your paper? Because I felt that it encompassed much broader mental dimensions.
I don't see it on my screen, do you?
The
No.
participants, yes.
The participants, okay. So can you read me again just the last question, because I'm not sure I understood.
The one it was addressed to you? Yes. To Dr. Amir, which definition do you use for gender in your paper? Because I felt that it encompassed much broader mental dimensions.
I'm not sure I have a specific definition to give here, but I think that gender is broad. Gender in its essence is a broad concept. It needs a broad definition. I certainly don't mean only the biological gender. I think that gender is a space, as I tried to explain in my paper. Gender is a space, it is a playful space. It is also a potential space, which involves external and internal elements. And when I say gender, I actually try to contain all these aspects in one word. We can go on to the previous question.
The previous question was about suppressing bisexuality and replacing it by polysexuality, I think.
Leticia, would you like to go first?
No, I want to hear more about this.
Okay, I can answer this question. There's two things that pop up with this. One is the invisibility of bisexual identities that I think sexual polymorphism is something that makes sense. That makes sense to revise in terms of what Freud was thinking or trying to name when he meant psychic bisexuality. My concern of shifting that from psychic bisexuality to psychic sexual polymorphism is that we may erase that identity of or idea of bisexuality as natively connected to human experience, which I find profoundly useful from that perhaps outdated term So yes, I think it needs revisiting, but again, not just one type of revision, but we need many people thinking about this and articulating what we believe to be psychic bisexuality.
Yes.
Well, there are two questions. The first one was if we need to change bisexuality by polysexuality, no?
Yes, please.
Yes. I think that bisexuality is a useful notion, but we should think also that it includes the masculine and the feminine together, but always as a dualistic system. So this is something that I am thinking about. I cannot give an answer to this question because it's a very complex question. But I think that we should think about these are part of the uncertainties that we have concerning the organization of the psychic organization. But I think that it's useful to think that bisexuality, not only anatomical, but also phantasmatic, also concerning fantasies, gender, etc., is very useful to think about patients, to clinically think about patients, but we also have to think, and this is something that we have to think concerning the future of psychoanalysis, what happens if we think of another way that goes beyond the masculine feminine and different combinations of the masculine feminine. This is something open for me, so I cannot give an answer. And the other question was for Dana and had to do with the definition of gender. I wanted to say that I think about gender as a construction, basically as a construction that has to do with subjectivity, but more specifically with identity. I know that identity is a term that is not classically psychoanalytical.
Yes.
But I think that we should think about identity, but think in another way. Not the identity as something that is equal to itself, but identity in movement. And in that sense, I coincide with what Dana proposes. Identity in the human beings and concerning subjectivity, I think that is something always in movement. And if it's not in movement, so problems will come. That is my opinion. Well, that's all.
Yes. I would like to go on a bit with questions. We have many questions. So there is one, it's near to the last one. Now, what do we do with 3 essays by Freud? I like the style, that's why I was. Now, what do we do with 3 essays by Freud? Are those still useful, or they remain only a piece of history of psychoanalysis? What's still relevant about them?
Dana, would you like to go first?
I would like you to go first.
No, you go first.
I think, well, I don't think that any piece of history is only a piece of history. I think that everything that constituted our psychoanalytic thinking is still vivid and alive, also, even when we revisit it. I also think that psychoanalysis is about rethinking and revisiting old concepts. So in a way, we have to revisit, we will always have to revisit Freud's 3 essays on sexuality. That's our obligation, and that will always be our basis of thinking about sexuality. We need to revisit it and in a way to refurnish it through our new knowledge and thinking about sexuality, but certainly not relate to it as a piece of history that is located in a museum, in a psychoanalytic museum. I don't think that's our intention. I don't think that's the intention of any of us.
Marco? Marco, you want?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Dana about this. I think, what do? We have to read it. We have to read the date that it was published and to see how centuries after a century and a chunk after, we're still talking about it. I think is very relevant. Again, as it happens with a lot of pieces of work that has been written in the 1800s, 1900s, there is language and culture that gets transmitted in the writing, and we do that way of filtering that information. And so I think we have to engage with the three essays as the three essays are, which are one of the most controversial pieces that Freud wrote. When he published that, there was a massive pushback from his group of people, from physicians. It rose a lot of shame, and so I think it is vital to see. Is one of the first pieces that we have recorded in terms of the intense reactions and rejection that psychoanalytic thinking had. Once you start to talk about sexuality in children, which is one of the first intense responses you get when you start to talk about trans experiences and children. And so it's just, I find it fascinating to this date. I find it very useful. And so, yeah, I think it's a very powerful piece of writing.
Leticia?
Yes, I think that Freud is alive, and we can work with him, but only if we think like him about a psychoanalysis in movement. It's the only way to work with Freud. There are many lines of thinking in Freud, and there are, as I say, coexisting. So I always work with Freudian proposals, but I see that as there are many lines, I named this kind of work intra-Freudian debates. So if we can work with Freud in that way, I think that is a very rich way of working. And I want to say also that if we don't do that, psychoanalysis and Freud will be frozen. I always remember that Derrida, the philosopher, he said that we have to be unfaithful in order to be faithful. And I think that this is very interesting to think of a psychoanalyst about Freud and about other important psychoanalysts, that we have to think about all they propose in a different way, not to repeat. We have to rethink all what is proposed. So psychoanalysis should be open, and certainly we don't have all the responses, and there are no responses that are an absolute. Concerning what three essays are useful today, I think that is very useful because, first of all, Freud separated homosexuality from perversions, and that is a very important thing. At that time, we have to rescue that. And certainly the role of tribes also. But there are many things that we have to say about 3Ss, and I think that it's a work that we should reread permanently.
Thank you. So, two unfaithful questions. The first one is, donc, psychic sexuality is bisexual. Why everybody is not bisexual? And the second one, I'm trying to send to our colleagues the questions. And the second one, how can psychoanalysis explain the non-binary and non-conforming identities? How can we explain these object choices?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Yes. How can psychoanalysis explain the non-binary and non-conforming identities? How can we explain these object choices? And the first one was why everybody is not bisexual. Exactly.
So I don't think I can answer for everybody's sexuality, why everybody isn't bisexual. I don't know. That's a great question to ask.
I think, excuse me, Marco, I have to read it again. Psychic sexuality is bisexual. The psychic sexuality is bisexual. Why everybody is not bisexual?
Yes.
Do you want to answer that, Dana?
I think that, as said, the psyche is bisexual. Why not everybody chooses to be bisexual in the actual world? There's always a gap between what we can live psychically, mentally, and what we choose to live in the actual world. It's not related only to sexuality. There's always a gap. I think that this is a possibility. This is a possibility that each person can posit him or herself on a spectrum relating to this question of bisexuality. And I think that every one of us is somewhere on this spectrum. But the choice is very personal. It's very individual and personal. So in a way, we are all bisexuals, and in a way, every one of us chooses another version of this bisexuality in the actual world.
And to build on what Dana is bringing, is the question geared towards penetrative sex? Because even if I choose a specific partner, a heterosexual love object, that still doesn't change my psychic bisexuality. I can still be psychically bisexual, regardless of my object choice and regardless of the sexual practices that I have. And to move towards the second question, that is, how can psychoanalysis talk about gender creative and gender non-conforming and gender non-binary experiences? I hope that we can do it with a lot of respect and non-pathologizing those identities. I think we struggle with describing from a psychoanalytic perspective part of those existences. We're starting to have a lot of more academic writing created by trans people and gender non-conforming people that can share more about their subjectivity and how they experience gender. From my perspective, to build on what Dana and Leticia have shared around gender, I think about gender as a formation of the unconscious, similar to dreams, but during wake time. And so I see it as the way that people express themselves through wake life. And that opens the door even more to think of gender as different set of lived experiences that can be conscious or unconscious. it's definitely not tied into object choice. Is definitely not tied into biological sex. It can be tied into, and it can be used defensively around object choice. Yeah, and I will stop there to let other people speak.
So, Leticia, maybe?
Yes, concerning the first question, I think that we cannot explain why we all agree that bisexuality is a part of our psyche, but why some people are bisexual and others no, well, it's difficult to say because this is one by one. It's a singular question. A singular analysis is required to know why, because the same question would be why, if we are bisexual, some people are polysexual. So all these things has to do with how we analyze one by one and each patient, and then perhaps we could say more about this. But certainly, I think that everybody is bisexual psychically. Concerning the non-binary identities and how can we explain psychoanalytically, I think that that was the question. I could say that I base my thoughts about these points on other epistemologies that are not binary logics but post-binary logics. And I think that this is important for psychoanalysis because Freud sustained dualistic logic, but not only dualistic logics, because when he spoke about complementary series, when he spoke in homosexual, in the case of homosexuality, about three variants to explain subjectivity and homosexuality in that girl, I think that he was thinking with a logic that was beyond dualistic logic. So that's why I say that Freud's oeuvre, we can see that there is an internal debate, because on one side he thinks dualistically, but on the other no. And I think the same we can say about Winnicott, for example, because I think that that first space, that transitional space, I think that is something that has to do with another kind of logic. It's not the mother and the baby. There is another space, so we can think of something new that is generated between two spaces. And that is another logic. It's not a dualistic logic. So psychoanalysis can explain some things, but thinking them, the same things, thinking them with another logic. That's all.
Can I add something to the previous, to the first question? Just one sentence. I think it relates to what Marco said earlier. I think that the question was about our bisexuality, and I think that since we are bisexuals psychically, I think that the question is how we express our bisexuality in our relations and in our object choice. And I think that even in heterosexual relations, there are homosexual aspects, because masculine aspects of one partner can meet masculine or feminine aspects of the other partner. In that way, it is it's a rich texture. It's a creative texture. We are much more creative, psychically and sexually, than this dichotomy of male and female and heterosexual and homosexual, or even heterosexual, bisexual and homosexual. I think that it's always a mixture of opportunities and of manifestations.
Okay, I have to go on. Given the panelists' emphasis on transcending the limitations of the gender binary in psychoanalysis approach to gender and sexuality, what do the panelists make of the burgeoning trend towards biological medical intervention as a response to gender dysphoria? You
Could
want
you
me to
repeat
read it
the
again?
question? Yes.
I have sent it so our attendees can have it in the screen. Given the panelists' emphasis on transcending the limitations of the gender binary in psychoanalysis approach to gender and sexuality, what do the panelists make of the burgeoning trend towards biological medical intervention as a response to gender dysphoria?
I can start if no one
Yes.
else wants to jump in. We have different language in different parts of the world. For instance, there was a fantastic paper in the Lancet written by a group of Mexican psychiatrists researching, working with trans women in a clinic in Mexico City. And they're trying to, there's an international move to try to move away from a diagnosis of gender dysphoria to diagnose gender distress. And so, because it places the term gender dysphoria places the tension in the gender creative person versus the distress that the gender creative person experiences in an environment that is invalidating of gender creative identities. And so this will question the narrative that right now there seems to be a trend where people are moving to modify their bodies. I think there has, since we have the technology to shift our bodies, there has been use to modify parts of the body. And now what does that mean for the person? I think it's on a case by case specifically. And what psychoanalysis can provide is a space to think and listen to these life experiences. And what we contribute to the dialogue is perhaps in slowing down these type of assumptions where we see, for instance, in Canada, there may be more visibility right now for trans people accessing gender confirming surgeries because there being more funding and because there's an increased access for people who want this type of treatment. So from the outside, it may look like there's a trend increasing, but there's actually a lot of work in terms of policies to increase access for people who need these type of interventions. So I know I'm not answering that question, but trying to provide a different narrative. Yeah.
Thank you. Leticia?
Yes, I think that this question is very difficult to answer because we cannot give a general answer. There are many different opinions, as we know, about this question. For some psychoanalysts, surgery produces a kind of psychic catastrophe. For others, they say the opposite, that they say that surgical intervention produces an equilibrium in the psyche of a person that is very with many problems, with suffering a lot about his condition or her condition. And I think that we can see both results because it's something that we have to analyze case by case. It is impossible to say in general which could be the solution for a specific person. For me, it's something open, so I cannot give a general response. It depends on the case. And I am not opposite to that solution, but I think that nowadays there are many people that have that kind of situation, that are living in that kind of situation, and they do not want to make an intervention, a surgical intervention. So there are so many different options, not only because of what the analyst thinks, but what the person that consults thinks, because that is important. So we have to hear, we have to analyze the situation, taking a point of departure that is what the patient that is consulting finally can and wants to do.
Dana?
I agree with both of you. I think it's a very difficult and complicated question, but I was waiting for this question to rise here, be raised here, because I think it's crucially relevant to what we are talking about. I think that gender crossing is not is far from being one thing. Or from my experience, clinical experience, and I have worked with a few patients that were dealing with this question, I think that it ranges from it can range from a psychotic pole to a neurotic pole, and be posited on anywhere on the spectrum between these two poles. And I think that for some patients, gender crossing can be a psychotic solution, which is dangerous to them. And then psychoanalysis has to take the role of creating the symbolic dimension where a concrete act when a concrete act comes to replace it. This is the most, I think, the most dangerous situation when gender crossing becomes a way of confirming the illusion that it is possible to feel a lack, to feel a very primal lack in that way, to replace symbolic work with concrete act. I think that Oren Goslan, one of our committee members, writes beautifully about it when he writes about the difference between the act and acting out. And he says something about gender crossing ranging between these poles of acting out and act, meaningful act. I think that this is our, this is always our role, to extract meaning, to enable a symbolic dimension. And if there is a working through in a symbolic dimension, then gender crossing can be a transformative act, one that saves some people's life and mental health. So this is the question that we have to ask in front of this situation, as well as in front of any other situation. Is it an act or an acting out? What is the symbolic dimension that we can visit and revisit when dealing with this question?
As an acting out, I have to say that we are reaching the end of this webinar. I'm so sorry for so many questions that we don't have the time to answer. I would like to thank a lot, very, very vividly, Leticia, Dana, and Marco for their so brilliant presentations and for their so interesting way to listen to questions and to answer. I would like to thank all of our participants for their attention and for the questions they had addressed to us. Our next webinar is in a month, the 28th of October. We will discuss on psychoanalysis and law, a necessary partnership. It will be with Plinio Montana, Robert Piles, Roland Doctor. We're waiting for you, and we thank you for your attention. Thanks again to Leticia, to Dana, and to Marco. Thank you very much.
Thank
Muchas
you.
gracias. Hasta luego. Bye bye, Dana. Bye bye, Leticia. Bye bye, Elena.